Unless your name is Mr. Monopoly, we can all agree that one entity owning everything is a bad idea. And if you've actually ever sat down to play the game without an annoying little brother who flips the board, you know exactly why. It starts out fine. Everyone's got a little money, a few properties, and even some dignity. But the moment one player pulls ahead, the entire game collapses into a slow and miserable ritual of paying rent you can't afford to someone who didn't need the money in the first place. There's no negotiating and there is no exit. There's just the board, one person who controls it, and everyone else playing to lose. Here's the thing though, that's not just a game. That's a near perfect description of what a unipolar international system looks like for the developing world. And unlike a bad board game, you can't just flip a table and go home, because for billions of people, that table is home. The rules that govern that table, who gets financing, security, and whose governments get recognized, determine whether children have schools, whether hospitals have medicines, and whether governments survive to see another day. Developing countries didn't write those rules. They were never even asked to contribute, but they are forced to play by them. It is on that basis that we are so incredibly proud to propose. This House believes that an international system with two or more superpowers is better for developing countries than a system with a single superpower. But before the argument, some framing. Developing country means nations dependent on external financing and security arrangements just to keep their governments functioning. Better means more sovereignty and better material outcomes for their people. And superpower means a state with the weight to shape the rules of the international system as opposed to simply following them. Now, the proposition doesn't need to defend a perfect multipolar world. We need to show that that developing countries have more agency when there is more than one superpower setting the terms. But before our opponents rise, they owe you an answer to one question. What mechanisms exist in a unipolar world for developing countries to contest the rules they never helped create? A system is not good for you simply because it is stable. It has to be one where you actually have a say. And our first argument is about just that: choice. When multiple superpowers compete for influence, developing countries gain something they almost never have: a genuine choice about how they develop. Under unipolarity, that choice never existed. The post-Cold War unipolar moment produced the Washington Consensus, prescriptions pushed through the IMF and World Bank demanding privatization, austerity, and rapid liberalization as the price of capital access. Developing countries didn't negotiate these terms. They were forced to accept them because there was no alternative, and the results were devastating. Structural adjustment programs gutted public health systems across sub-Saharan Africa and produced what economists now call a lost decade of development. Governments were forced to cut the exact services their populations needed most, not because it was good policy, but because the alternative was being cut off entirely. Argentina, which followed the consensus more faithfully than almost any other country, ended up collapsing entirely in 2001. And the people who paid that price weren't the economists at the IMF. They were the ordinary Argentines who lost their savings overnight. Now contrast that with what multipolarity produced. When China emerged as an alternative source of financing, countries like Ethiopia and Vietnam suddenly had options. They pursued state-led development models like the Washington Consensus had explicitly ruled out and produced some of the fastest growth rates in modern history. When there is only one source of capital, only one development model is on offer, and you take it or you go without it. When there are multiple sources, the developing country gets to negotiate, push back, and design something that actually fits its own context. Rwanda built a state-directed economy that the Washington Consensus would have condemned. Vietnam protected its industries for decades before opening up selectively. Neither of those stories happen in a unipolar world, and that's the difference between choosing and complying. Our second argument goes deeper. The real problem with unipolarity is not just that the hegemon sets the rules, it's that the hegemon decides what counts as legitimate in the first place. In a unipolar world, a single power determines which governments get recognized, which conflicts get intervention, and which one gets ignored. Developing countries have no recourse when those judgments go against them because they aren't participants in the system. They are simply the subjects of it. And I have personal stake here. My grandfather, Hashim Usman, served as Sudan's foreign minister from 1984 to 1985, and Sudan at that time was in freefall. There was a famine, a government running out of money, and the IMF knocking on their door, telling them to cut their spending, remove their food subsidies, and liberalize their economy, or they will walk. And Sudan complied, not because those were good policies for a country literally watching its people starve, but because the United States was the only patron available. The IMF was Washington's instrument instrument and there was nowhere else to turn. That's what unipolarity looks like from the inside. It doesn't look like oppression. It looks like a phone call where you already know you're going to have to say yes before you even pick up. And what multipolarity offers is that sometimes you don't always have to pick up that call. You can wait for a better one, because sometimes the mere existence of an alternative is enough to change the terms of the conversation, even if you never actually switch patrons. The structural shift from one power to many is what changes the calculation for developing countries. The opposition will tell you that multipolarity means proxy wars. They will point to Angola, Vietnam, and Afghanistan and say that superpower competition turns developing countries into battlegrounds. We don't minimize those tragedies, but we ask you to be precise about what actually caused them. What devastated the developing world during the Cold War was not multipolarity as a structural condition, but rather ideologically totalizing bipolarity, two superpowers locked in an existential contest, each convinced that the other was an existential threat, and each willing to arm and fund whoever would bleed on their behalf. That is not what today's multipolar world looks like. A world where the US, China, India, Russia, Brazil, and other countries compete through trade deals, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic relationships does not replicate that dynamic. The incentive structure is completely different. The bottom line is that developing countries cannot be free if there is only one court, one bank, and one power that decides whose sovereignty matters. And the opposition has no answer to what recourse looks like in their world. They can tell you unipolarity is stable, but they cannot tell you that it is just. Multipolarity doesn't fix that completely, but it means the door isn't locked from the outside anymore. And for a country that has spent generations with no door at all, that distinguishment matters. It is on that basis that we are so incredibly proud to propose.